Okay, today we're going to solve quadratic equations using other techniques, not factoring, basically. And so before we start, I'm going to define a square root. So a square root of a number x is some number whose square is x. Okay? And the notation we're going to use for the square root is that thing that kind of looks like, a house on it. Okay, so before we start, let's just look at let's square a few numbers. Let's look at, maybe 7 squared, and maybe let's square negative 7 as well. Okay, that, if I square 7, I get 49. And if I square negative 7, I'm also going to get 49. So the point I'm trying to make is that 7 and negative 7 are both square roots of 49. Okay, so the next question is, can we take the square root of a negative number? What do we think? Okay, they all are saying no, and I'd say, you can, but we can't yet. Okay, so my answer to that is not yet. For now, if we are asked to take the square root of a negative number, we're going to say that that doesn't exist. That's not entirely true. We'll spend some time in the second semester looking at times. Yeah, we'll be looking at some complex numbers. We'll get I in the mix. It'll be great. Okay, but the idea is that can we take a real number? Let's think about the square root of negative 25. We know that 5 times 5 is 25. So let's think about, could we do 5 times 5? Well, that's equal to positive 25. Well, maybe negative 5 will work. If we square negative 5, we still get positive 25. So we can't square a number and get something negative. Therefore, we can't take the square root of a negative number yet. Okay, but we will in the future. All right, so the first way that we're going to solve quadratic equations today is going to be using square roots, or solve directly is what I would call it. And so what we're going to do is as opposed to last time where we set it equal to 0 and factor, if we see that there's no x, that there's only x squared and a number, then we can do this. We can solve directly. So this is only valid for ax squared plus bx plus c when b equals 0. And that's the only time this is going to work. All right, so I'm going to try to solve for x. So I'm going to say x squared equals 16. And then I'm going to take the square root of both sides, because that's the opposite of squaring. And now I'm going to have to take a second and ask you another question. All right, what is the square root of x squared? X. Yes, you would think, right? It makes sense. The square root of x squared is x. Sometimes, but not always. Okay, so let's try some numbers. Let's try 10 and negative 10. Okay, so I'm going to square 10, and that's 100, and I take the square root of it, and that's 10. And then if I take negative 10 and I square it, that's positive 100, and I take the square root of positive 100, and I get 10. So it seems like when I put in negative 10, I lost the negativity. So what's something else that we studied in this class where, it didn't do anything to a positive number, but we lost the negativity on a negative number? Absolute value, yes. So actually, in the truest sense, the square root of x squared is equal to the absolute value of x. So back to the problem we were working, now I've got the absolute value of x is equal to 4. And we knew how to solve that a couple of units ago. If the absolute value of x was equal to 4, then x either had to equal 4 or it had to equal negative 4. Okay, and this is why we get the plus minus when we take the square root of both sides of an equation. You won't see me going to absolute value of x really anymore today, or when we take the square root of both sides of an equation. I'll just expect you to remember that we need to consider the positive and the negative square root when we take the square root of both sides of an equation. Now I want y'all to try the next two, the negative 3x squared plus 75 equals 0, and the x squared minus 80 equals 20. Solve for x the same way I did on the one on the left. Okay, you don't need to show the square root x, the absolute value x step if you don't feel like you need to. But I'm going to freeze the screen. I'm going to pause the video, so if you're watching at home, you want to work these on your own, pause it, check your answer. Okay, here you go. So in the one on the middle, I subtracted 75 and then divided by negative 3. And then I take the square root of both sides. So when I take the square root of both sides of an equation, I have to remember the plus or minus. And then the one on the right was maybe even a little bit easier. I just added 80, and then I took the square root of both sides, not forgetting the plus or minus, because there's two numbers that I could square and get 100. I could square 10 and get 100. I could also square negative 10 and get 100. And also, major thanks to 201 for giving me part of his cookie. That was really nice. That was just what I needed. Next, we're going to find the zeros of more of these things that we can solve directly. And remember that find the zeros is just find where y equals 0. Let's solve the equation y equals 0. All right, so of the three of these, I think x squared minus 25, we've kind of already done a couple like that. I'm going to do these other two. So I'm going to say y equals 0, which is 100x squared minus 49 equals 0. 100x squared equals 49, and x squared is 49 over 100. Okay. Now another square root property that I guess I didn't think to give y'all is the square root of a divided by b. We can take those square roots separately. So when I take the square root of both sides, I'm going to have the plus, the positive, or the negative square root of 49 divided by 10. And in this one on the right, I'm going to, again, solve y equals 0, but I'm just going to kind of go straight to 6x squared minus 1 equals 0. Okay, once I get x squared equals 1/6, I'll say x equals, well, I don't know the square root of 6, so I'll just say the square root of 1/6 or the negative square root of 1/6. And we can just leave it like that in this course. All right, and below that we have a nice geometry problem, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. Now, if we have an equation that's got a b that's not 0 and it's not factorable, then we would have an equation like ax squared plus bx plus c. We want to set it equal to 0. Okay, the solutions to this are given by the quadratic formula. And I might record a separate video showing you why that's true if you're interested. I know that 041 said you like completing the square. Most of us don't like completing the square. And so, again, in the interest of time, I'm going to save that for a separate video. But I'll give you the quadratic formula right now. It's x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Yeah, and don't give me that over there. It's not that bad. No, not you. Definitely you. In the back row. No complaining. It's not that bad. It's not going to be nearly as bad this year as it was in years past. I don't doubt that, but it's going to be okay. Okay, here I am. I'm highlighting it. And I'll tell you, the best way to remember this is to just write it over and over again. You can sing the song if you like. You can do whatever you want. Yes, I hear you singing it over there, 979. But the more you write it, the more you'll remember it. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so I'm going to do 3 examples real quick. I'm going to say that, well, in this case, A equals 2, B equals 3, and C equals 5. We know that x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so I'm going to plug in these pieces. Negative b is going to be negative 3 plus or minus the square root. B squared is 9 minus 4 times a is 2 and c is 5. Oh, no, c is negative 5.
Are we going to have to remember this equation again?
Yes, question in the front is, are you expected to know the quadratic formula? And the answer is yes. And then all divided by 2 times a. Okay, so once I actually kind of put those numbers together, I'm going to get negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 49 over 4. Okay, that's negative 3 plus 7 over 4, or negative 3 minus 7 over 4, which is negative 3 plus 7 is 4 divided by 4 is 1, or negative 10 fourths. Okay, and notice that when b squared minus 4ac, if b squared minus 4ac is positive, I'll get 2 solutions. Okay? More on that in a few minutes. All right, another one. And this one I'm going to go through a little quicker. A equals 9, b is negative 6, c equals 1. Write it every time. And then I'm going to plug in the pieces. Negative of negative 6 is positive 6, plus or minus the square root of b squared is 36, minus 4 times 9 times 1. Okay, that's going to be 36 minus 36, all over 18. So I get 6 plus or minus the square root of 0 is 0 over 18. Now you can add 0 or subtract 0, and you get the same thing. So that is just 6 over 18, or 1/3. Okay, notice that when b squared minus 4ac was equal to 0, I ended up with only one solution. All right, and then another one I've got is x squared plus x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, so a, b, and c are all 1. Write it every time. That's the best way to remember it. X is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And then I'm going to plug in a, b, and c are all 1. So x equals negative 1 plus or minus square root of 1 minus 4 times 1 times 1 all over 2 times 1. Okay, so what do we do when we see this, the square root of negative 3? Yeah, you're not going to go any further and
Put it in get it out of the
yeah, no, I'm just talking about the square root of the negative number. We say at this point, that's kind of a game over, no solution. I'm going to say no real solution. So notice that if b squared minus 4ac came back negative, we ended up taking the square root of a negative number, and therefore we got no real solution. All right, so the discriminant. The discriminant is the thing inside the square root on the quadratic formula. Okay, so definition of the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. And what we just saw was that if the discriminant is positive, we have plus or minus the square root of a positive number, so our solution could be 2 different things.
Do you monetize your YouTube videos?
I do not. Okay, so I was saying if b squared minus 4ac is positive, we get 2 real solutions. If b squared minus 4ac is 0, then we get 1 real solution. And if b squared minus 4ac is negative, then we'll have no real solution. Okay? So, looking at these next problems, so on the quiz next time, one of the first questions will be asked is, how many solutions are there to this equation? So what we do is we check b squared minus 4ac. Is 4 minus 4 times 2 times 3. That's negative. And therefore, there's no real solution. Over here, I'm going to take b squared minus 4ac. That's equal to b squared is 16. Minus 4 times 1 times 4 is going to be, okay, that's going to be 0. Therefore, I'm going to have one real solution. And then over here, well, I would expect this to come back positive since I've gotten one that's negative and one that's 0, but let's look. B squared minus 4ac is 81 minus 4 times 1 times 4 is 16. That's a positive number. Okay, it's positive, therefore I'm getting two real solutions. Okay, and lastly, I've got one more that we're going to solve using the quadratic formula. Okay, remember the first step we had before was set the equation to 0. This one's already set to 0. Then we were going to factor. And this one's factorable. Okay, so I'm going to actually choose a different equation. And here we've got one where I can apply all the steps. And remember, our first step was set the equation to 0. So I'll subtract 1 from both sides, and I'll say that x squared plus 10x minus 1 equals 0. Then I factored if I could. Well, it turns out that this one isn't factorable because there aren't two numbers that multiply to negative 1 and add to positive 10. And so, in the absence of factoring, we use the quadratic formula. So I recommend you write it out every time. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a, which is going to be negative 10 plus or minus the square root. B squared is 100 minus 4 times 1 times negative 1, all over 2 times 1. And we could say that that's, okay, the square root of 104. That might be something we could simplify. But if you needed to simplify it, you could use the TI-30 for that. So I'm left with negative 10 plus the square root of 104 divided by 2, or maybe negative 10 minus the square root of 104 divided by 2. And remember that because b squared minus 4ac was a positive number, I got two